1 minute ago, an entire section of California's coastline simply vanished. No warning sirens, no emergency alerts, just the deafening crack of Earth surrendering to gravity. Where homes once stood, now there is only a raw wound of exposed soil and shattered concrete sliding toward the Pacific. 100 feet of cliff, stable for decades, collapsed in seconds. Families who woke to ocean views now stare at the void where their backyards used to be. This was supposed to be one of the most monitored coastlines on Earth, so how did the ground fail so catastrophically? What secrets were hiding beneath the surface? And if this happened here, where else along California's 1,023 miles of coastline is the Earth preparing to let go? But the collapse itself was only the beginning. The first sign something had gone terribly wrong came not from geologists or warning systems, but from a neighborhood dog. In the pre-dawn darkness, its frantic barking drew a resident to the window just in time to see the impossible. A portion of the street simply disappeared, taking with it a section of retaining wall and the corner of a parked car. Within minutes, more cracks spiderwebbed across adjacent properties. Driveways buckled, foundation walls groaned. The sound of fracturing concrete echoed through the fog like breaking bones. Emergency responders arrived to find residents stumbling from their homes in confusion and disbelief. The collapse zone had expanded in real time. What had started as a localized failure was spreading laterally, consuming property after property as hidden weaknesses gave way. By sunrise, the scope of the disaster had become undeniably clear. This was not a surface failure. This was something far deeper, and the investigation would reveal how much the experts had missed. Before the morning fog had lifted, teams from the California Geological Survey and the United States Geological Survey deployed to the scene. Their equipment arrived in dust-covered trucks, ground-penetrating radar systems, seismic sensors, soil sampling kits, and mobile data stations bristling with antennas. The first priority was establishing a safety perimeter, but the second was more urgent. They needed to understand how far the instability extended. Ground-penetrating radar operators began systematic sweeps across the remaining properties, walking predetermined grids with their instruments humming. Each pass sent electromagnetic pulses deep into the earth, reading the echoes that bounced back from underground structures. The data they collected was encrypted and logged with precise GPS coordinates. Chain of custody protocols were implemented immediately. Every sample, every reading, every observation would need to hold up not just in scientific journals, but potentially in courtrooms. What they discovered in those first hours would change everything. The mobile laboratory set up in a parking lot 3 blocks from the collapse zone became the nerve center of the investigation. Inside the climate-controlled trailer, technicians processed soil samples with surgical precision. Each core sample arrived sealed and labeled. 2 technicians worked every intake, cross-checking identification numbers against field logs. Moisture content was measured first, then mineral composition, then structural integrity. The calibration protocols were exhaustive. Every instrument was verified against known standards before any readings were recorded. This meticulous process was not paranoia, it was necessity, because what the samples were showing defied the assumptions that had governed coastal planning for decades, and the first major discovery was about to reshape the entire investigation.
Dr. Lena Ortiz, a senior geologist with the California Geological Survey, was the first to recognize what the radar maps were revealing. The screens displayed cross-sections of the subsurface in false color, with dense materials showing as bright returns and empty spaces appearing as dark voids. Beneath the collapsed section, she found exactly what she expected, the chaotic signature of failed earth and debris. But it was what she found beneath the still-standing properties that made her reach for her phone. Elongated cavities stretched through the subsurface like dark arteries. Some were narrow, barely a meter across. Others yawned wider than a city bus. They extended not just seaward toward the cliff face, but inland, beneath homes that had shown no visible signs of stress. The depth and scale were unprecedented. These were not the shallow erosion features that standard monitoring would detect. These voids reached 8 to 12 meters below the surface, far beneath the foundations of the structures above. More troubling still was their geometry. Standard erosion creates relatively uniform features. These cavities were irregular, branching, connected by narrow channels that suggested a far more complex process than simple wave action. The implications were immediate. What came next shocked even the scientists. The soil cores extracted from around the void structures told a story that no one had anticipated. Layer after layer showed anomalies that should not have existed. Standard coastal stratigraphy follows predictable patterns. Native soils give way to sedimentary deposits, which transition into bedrock or consolidated marine terraces. The samples from this site followed no such pattern. Entire layers were missing. Others appeared in the wrong sequence, as if the earth itself had been shuffled like a deck of cards. Mineral transitions that should have occurred gradually instead showed abrupt boundaries. Most alarming was the presence of loose, unconsolidated material in zones that should have been stable. Comparison with archived surveys from previous decades revealed the scope of the change. Ground that had been classified as competent in 1998 now showed significant degradation. Material that had registered as consolidated now exhibited the structural characteristics of loose fill. The evidence pointed to processes that had been operating invisibly for years. But the collapse was not finished. Radar echoes from subsequent sweeps revealed something the team had feared but hoped not to find. Beneath the remaining cliffs, water was moving.
The signatures were unmistakable. Saturated zones that should have been dry, underground channels carrying groundwater toward the cliff face, pockets of accumulated moisture lubricating the interfaces between soil layers. This was not a completed event. This was an ongoing process. The same forces that had triggered the initial collapse were still at work, still undermining the remaining structures, still carving new pathways through the weakened earth. Surface erosion from wave action could explain cliff retreat measured in inches per year. It could not explain the formation of complex void networks 40 feet below the surface. Something else was happening here, something the monitoring systems had never been designed to detect. And it was spreading. Within 72 hours, the danger zone had to be redrawn 3 times. Each new survey revealed instability extending further than previous models had predicted. Emergency management officials convened urgent meetings with geological teams. The data was clear. The collapse was not an isolated failure. It was a symptom of deep structural weakness that extended along a significant portion of the coastline. Risk models that had guided development for decades were suddenly obsolete. Properties that had been classified as stable now sat above documented void networks. Infrastructure that had passed every previous inspection was revealed to be perched above compromised substrate. The question was no longer what had caused the collapse. The question was how much more was going to fall. The evacuation order came at 4:47 in the afternoon, delivered simultaneously through emergency broadcast systems, text alerts, and door-to-door notification teams. Within the designated zone, residents had 6 hours to gather essential belongings and leave. Multilingual emergency broadcasts rolled across radio frequencies in English, Spanish, Mandarin, and Vietnamese. Law enforcement coordinated traffic control at every intersection leading out of the area. Public transit agencies diverted buses to serve as evacuation transport. Emergency shelters activated at 3 locations, each staffed with medical personnel, social workers, and volunteers. The efficiency of the response reflected years of planning, but no amount of planning could eliminate the human cost of displacement. And one family's story would come to represent thousands.
Laia Hernandez had lived in her home for 31 years. She had raised 2 children within those walls, celebrated anniversaries, mourned losses, and built the accumulation of memories that transforms a house into something irreplaceable. She had 6 hours to decide what mattered most. The family photographs came first, then the documents, then the medications. The rest, the furniture, the decorations, the physical weight of 3 decades, had to stay behind. In the shelter that night, surrounded by neighbors in similar states of shock, she found herself unable to describe what she felt. My father built that back deck with his own hands. My daughter took her first steps in the living room. How do you pack that into a suitcase? Her words echoed the quiet devastation spreading through the displacement community. But the investigation was about to reveal that this collapse might have been prevented. Archived permit records told a damning story. 8 years before the collapse, amendments had been approved for stormwater drainage modifications along the affected stretch of coastline. The original system directed runoff away from the cliff edge. The modifications rerouted portions of that flow to new discharge points, several of which sat directly above areas that would later develop void structures. Internal communications recovered during the investigation showed that at least one reviewing engineer had raised concerns about the changes. The modified drainage pattern, he warned, could increase subsurface saturation in zones with known groundwater sensitivity.
Those concerns were noted. They were not acted upon. The amendments were fast-tracked through approval, driven by pressure to clear infrastructure backlogs. The reviewing engineer's memo was filed, no follow-up study was commissioned. The water kept flowing, the voids kept growing, and the warnings kept being ignored. In August of 2024, Dr. Ortiz had submitted a formal memo to the Regional Planning Department. Her analysis of groundwater data from monitoring wells in the area had identified anomalous patterns that, she wrote, warranted immediate subsurface investigation. She requested authorization for ground-penetrating radar surveys along a 3-mile stretch of coastline. The estimated cost was $340,000. The estimated time to completion was 4 months. Her request was denied. Budget constraints were cited. Other priorities took precedence. 14 months later, she stood at the edge of a collapse zone that her surveys might have predicted, watching rescue workers search for signs of further instability. Her memo had not been lost, it had simply been weighed against other considerations and found wanting. The cost of the denied survey would have been a fraction of the damage now unfolding. But the failure of oversight extended beyond a single denied request. Document recovery efforts revealed gaps in the approval records that could not be explained by administrative error. Amendment applications that should have included geotechnical assessments contained no such attachments. Review signatures appeared on forms that bore no evidence of actual review. Development along the affected coastline had continued throughout the period when subsurface conditions were actively deteriorating. The institutional failures compounded the geological ones, and the infrastructure at risk extended far beyond residential properties. Highway 1, California's iconic coastal route, runs within 200 meters of the collapse zone. Traffic data shows over 15,000 vehicles traverse this section daily. The same subsurface processes affecting the residential cliff extend beneath the highway's foundations. Caltrans engineers conducted emergency assessments within 48 hours of the collapse. Their findings were not released publicly, but emergency repair crews were observed installing monitoring equipment along a half-mile stretch of the roadway. Power transmission lines serving 23,000 customers run through the affected corridor. A regional water treatment facility sits 1.2 miles from the collapse zone, within the geological formation now understood to be compromised. Environmental officials confirmed that any failure affecting the treatment facility could result in contamination discharge to coastal waters. The cascade potential was becoming clear. If the highway fails, emergency access disappears. If power lines fall, the treatment facility loses operation capacity. If the treatment facility fails, contamination spreads.
Each failure makes the next more likely. Each system depends on the others, and all of them sit on ground that is still moving. The data compilation that followed revealed a pattern that no one wanted to see. Void structures were not confined to the collapse zone. Ground-penetrating radar surveys extending along the coastline from Mendocino to Monterey identified similar anomalies at multiple locations. The geological signatures were consistent: elongated subsurface cavities, irregular geometry, evidence of water transport through compromised material. This was not a single isolated event. This was a systemic condition affecting hundreds of miles of California coastline. Research from Scripps Institution of Oceanography had documented cliff retreat rates exceeding 16 feet per year in some locations. USGS models projected that sea level rise could double erosion rates by 2100. But those models had assumed surface processes. They had not accounted for what was happening beneath. The historical survey reassessment painted an even more troubling picture. Archived data from the 1990s and early 2000s had classified vast stretches of coastline as stable or low risk. Those classifications had been based on surface observations and standard boring samples. The new radar surveys revealed that surface conditions had been masking subsurface deterioration for decades. Zones that had been rated as stable now showed extensive void development. Areas marked as low risk exhibited the same saturated channels and compromised interfaces that had preceded the collapse. The unknowns were expanding faster than the knowns. Environmental data integration revealed additional complexity. Storm records, tide data, and groundwater measurements showed correlations that had previously gone unrecognized. Peak void expansion aligned with periods of elevated rainfall. Subsurface saturation increased measurably following king tide events. Groundwater levels throughout the affected region had risen by an average of 0.4 meters over the previous decade. The climate was intensifying. The coast was responding. But the patterns remained incomplete. Some high-exposure areas showed no void development. Some low-exposure areas were riddled with cavities. The uncertainty itself was a finding. Emergency countermeasures deployed rapidly. Sensor networks were installed across the expanded monitoring zone. Accelerometers to detect ground motion, tilt meters to measure subsurface shift, groundwater probes to track saturation levels. Real-time data now feeds to monitoring centers where analysts watch for the signatures that precede failure. Drone surveys map the coastline weekly, documenting changes too subtle for ground observation. The surveillance grid has expanded threefold since the collapse. It is still not enough.
A construction moratorium now covers all development within the expanded risk zone. Buffer requirements have been extended. Permit reviews have been suspended pending completion of comprehensive geological reassessment. An independent review commission has been established, staffed with external experts who carry no institutional history with the affected agencies. The policy reforms are significant. Whether they are sufficient remains to be seen. Public response systems have activated at every level. Homeowners have received monitoring checklists and structural warning sign guides. A public reporting hotline processes hundreds of calls daily. Rapid inspection teams respond to reports of new cracks, settling, or drainage anomalies. The community has become part of the monitoring network. Every resident is now a sensor. Utility companies have conducted emergency assessments of pipeline routes and power line corridors. Vulnerability mapping has identified over 40 miles of infrastructure requiring expedited inspection. Emergency shutdown protocols have been revised. Contingency plans now account for scenarios that were considered impossible 6 months ago. The coast is changing faster than policy can adapt. Infrastructure designed for a stable shoreline now sits on dynamic ground. Climate intensification adds stress to systems already operating beyond their design parameters. The geological processes that shaped this collapse operate on timescales that human institutions struggle to comprehend. A void can develop over decades, then fail in seconds. A coastline can appear stable for generations, then surrender without warning. The gap between geological time and human time is where disasters incubate. What happened here was not a random failure. It was the consequence of processes that were operating in plain sight, documented in data that sat unread in archived files, predicted by models that were never funded, warned against in memos that were never acted upon. The ground failed because the systems designed to protect it failed first. Scientists now confirm that the California coastline is more vulnerable than previous assessments indicated. They confirm that the processes driving this collapse are active elsewhere. They confirm that monitoring systems designed decades ago are inadequate for the conditions now emerging. What they cannot confirm is where the next failure will occur, or when. Over 27 million Californians live in coastal counties. Billions of dollars of infrastructure sit within zones now classified as requiring reassessment. The ground beneath their feet is the same ground that collapsed here. The investigation has answered many questions, but the most important question remains open. If this monitored coastline could fail without warning, what else is hiding beneath the surface, waiting for its moment to let go?